Hello, 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 everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I'm a Tolkien scholar. And what that means is that I am, generally speaking, the kind of guy that you can come to with any sort of question about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, whether it's The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings or The Silmarillion or any of its satellite stories, his translations, his academic work, whatever you got. The questions that I get do tend to be centered more on the first three things, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and The Silmarillion, but every once in a while I'll have to pull out his letters or, one of the 15 reference volumes that are out there. So sometimes it does go a bit deeper, and I do enjoy when I get to do a bit of research and everything. My specialty is in linguistics, but I cover all sorts of things with Tolkien. So I'm here to answer your questions. And we have 10 questions to get to today, and some of them are quite big questions with a lot to talk about, so that's pretty cool. And a while back, I had said, do you want me to do, 15 to 20 questions and go through them, a little bit more quickly, or do you want me to do more like 10 to 12 and do it, more in-depth? And overwhelmingly, people wanted me to do less and more depth, so that's what we've decided to do, and it really works out for me. So there we have it. This is episode 100, which I was sort of struggling with the idea of, do I do something special for episode 100 or not? And then I thought, well, I don't know. I don't really have anything prepared. It sort of just came up on me really fast. And maybe we'll do something for 11D1, like for Bilbo's birthday, But just a regular episode, really, although I do have a rather interesting reading to do from The Return of the King in just a little bit. Of course, if you want to ask a question, you can go ahead right there in the comments. I try to get to comment questions as often as I can, usually 2-3 times a week. But if you want to be featured in a video, or if you feel that your question is sort of too in-depth for just a quick comment on YouTube, you can use a website called Quora. Quora is a knowledge-sharing platform where you can ask any sort of question and have people with relevant expertise or knowledge answer you. And if you ask any sort of question about Tolkien on there, you're going to get a list of names that you could ask specifically those people. Of course, anybody can answer any question, but you can tag people in it, and my name will be at or near the top of that list of names. And also, not to mention that the link to my Quora specifically is in the description of this video, and in fact every video I do, as well as a link to the Grey Havens, which is my my Tolkien space where all of my answers are, as well as other people, and it's all Tolkien. It's not a general fantasy space. So anyway, very quick channel update. I think we were at, now we'd reached past 2100, right? We're at 2178 in terms of subscribers, so that's absolutely fantastic. Our goal was 2000, and we, and the green screen came of that. I don't know what the next goal shall be. Maybe 5,000 should be the next goal. And well, actually, no. Well, the green screen was part of it. The goal was going to be to do live streaming on YouTube, and we have started doing that. And those are very successful. Well, the first one didn't go so well, but it didn't work at all. But then once I got it fixed, it all worked out. But maybe for 5,000 we can do something special. I'll have to figure out something special that we can come up with, to have a goal here. But anyway, today I'm going to be reading you from The Return of the King, being the third part of The Lord of the Rings. And I thought for our 100th episode, we might as well do something a little bit momentous here. This is not related to any specific question that we have today. I've been trying to make the reading somewhat related to some of the questions. Sometimes a reading could be related to several questions, but in this case, I really just wanted to do the part in the book where Aragorn is crowned. The One Ring has been destroyed, and Frodo and Sam have been delivered safely from Mordor to the field of Cormallen, which is a place in Ithilien, which is essentially just eastern Gondor, and now they're in Minas Tirith, which is pretty close by, actually. And Aragorn is about to be crowned. Faramir met Aragorn in the midst of those there assembled, and he knelt and said, "The last steward of Gondor begs leave to surrender his office." And he held out a wide rod. But Aragorn took the rod and gave it back, saying, "That office is not ended, and it shall be thine and thy heirs, as long as my line shall last. Do now thy office." Then Faramir stood up and spoke in a clear voice, "Men of Gondor, hear now the steward of this realm. Behold, One has come to claim kingship again at last. Here is Aragorn, son of Arathorn, chieftain of the Dunedain of Arnor, captain of the host of the west, bearer of the star of the north, wielder of the sword reforged, victorious in battle, whose hands bring healing, the Elfstone, Elisar of the line of Elendil, Isildur's son, Elendil, son of Numenor. Shall he be king, and enter the city and dwell there? And all the host and all the people cried yea with one voice. And Eorith said to her kinswoman, This is just a ceremony, as we have in the city, cousin, for he is already entered, and I was telling you, and he said to me, and then again she was obliged to silence, for Faramir spoke again. Men of Gondor, the lore masters tell us it was the custom of old that the king should receive the crown from his father ere he died, or if that might not be, that he should go alone and take it from the hands of his father, in the tomb where he was laid. But since things must now be done otherwise, using the authority of the steward, I have today brought hither from Rath-Dynen the crown of Eärnur the last king, whose days passed in the time of our long fathers of old. Then the guard stepped forward, and Faramir opened the casket, and he held up an ancient crown. It was shaped like the helms of the guards of the citadel, save that it was loftier, and it was all white, and the wings on either side were wrought of pearl and silver in the likenesses of the wings of a sea-bird, for it was the emblems of kings who came over the sea. And 7 gems of adamant were set in the circlet, and upon its summit was set a single jewel, the light of which went up like a flame. Then Aragorn took the crown and held it up and said, Etiarlo edorena utulian, Sinomi Marovan, ar Hildinyar ten ambar nata. And those were the words that Elendil spoke when he came out of the sea on the wings of the wind. Out of the great sea to Middle-earth I am come. In this place will I abide in my heirs unto the ending of the world. Then, to the wonder of many, Aragorn did not put the crown on his head, but gave it back to Faramir and said, By the labour and valour of many I come into my inheritance. In token of this I would have the ring-bearer bring the crown to me, and let Mithrandir set it upon my head if he will. For he has been the mover in all that has been accomplished, and this is his victory. Then Frodo came forward and took the crown from Faramir and bore it to Gandalf. And Aragorn knelt, and Gandalf set the white crown upon his head and said, Now come the days of the king, and may they be blessed while the thrones of the Valar endure. But when Aragorn rose, all that beheld him gazed in silence, for it seemed to him that he was revealed to them now for the first time. Tall as the sea kings of old, he stood above all that were near. Ancient days he seemed, and yet in the flower of manhood, and wisdom sat upon his brow, and strength and healing were in his hands, and a light was about him. And then Faramir cried, Behold the king! And in that moment all the trumpets were blown, and the king Elisar went forth and came to the barrier, and Hurin of the Keys thrust it back. And amid the music of the harp and viol and of flute and the singing of clear voices, the king passed through the flower-laden streets, and came to the citadel, and entered in. And the banner of the tree and the stars unfurled upon the topmost tower, and the reign of King Elisar began, of which many songs have told. In his time in the city was made more fair than it had ever been, even in the days of its first glory, and it was filled with trees and with fountains, and its gates were wrought of mithril and steel, and its streets were paved with white marble, and the folk of the mountain laboured in it, and the folk of the wood rejoiced to come here, and all was healed and made good. And the houses were filled with men and women and the laughter of children, and no window was blind or any courtyard empty. And after the ending of the third age of the world came into the new age, it preserved the memory and the glory of the years that were gone. So, there's a few things to talk about here in this scene. Everybody, they bring the crown to Aragorn, and everybody expects him to just put it on his head, and he hands it back to Faramir, and he says, you know what, give it to Frodo, and then have Frodo give it to Gandalf, and then Gandalf can put it on my head. And he wants to honor Frodo, obviously, as the destroyer of the ring. Of course, Frodo didn't actually destroy the ring, but he did something that was physically and spiritually impossible. He got the ring to Mount Doom, and thus it was destroyed. So he already did this magnificent heroic feat. And of course, Gandalf, he points out that Gandalf, Mithrandir as he's called, he's the architect of everything that has happened, and this is his victory. So, of course, Gandalf crowns him. The seabirds, it's mentioned the wings on the sides of the crown are like seabirds, and this goes back to, of course, the Sea Kings. They came from over the sea, from Numenor. But it goes back even further than this. Because if you go back to the First Age, before Numenor even existed, Elros, the first king of Numenor, his father, of course, was Earendil. And Earendil, Earendil and Elwing, that was the coupling that led to Elrond and Elros. But Elwing specifically, Earendil specifically, he was born of Tur, who was a mortal man, and he married the princess of Gondolin. And there was sort of a prophecy to go with that if Tur should come to Gondolin, despite not being an elf, and only elves, and only specifically Noldor elves, being allowed to go to Gondolin, and that a star will be born. And this star, of course, was Earendil. It sort of foreshadows Earendil being in the sky with his ship, the Vingalot, and the Silmaril, and being a star in the sky, and which is mentioned several times in The Lord of the Rings. But what's interesting here is that Tur started his journey by going to the sea. He was actually the first mortal man ever to come to the ocean. And he was led there by swans, seabirds, and it was mentioned that he always really had an affinity for swans, and that's why he followed them. The number 7 is very important because there were 7 birds, 7 stars in the Valakirka, which is also the Great Dipper, 7 stars in the flag of Numenor, 7 gems on the crown of Elendil. Of course, this isn't actually Elendil's crown, because Isildur wore Elendil's crown, and it went with him when he died. And it actually, Aragorn later on, it actually finds the actual crown of Elendil, the Elendilmere, in Orthanc, of all places. Apparently Saruman had it, and he comes to realize that Saruman had found Isildur's remains and perhaps burned them with dishonor in the furnaces of Isengard, and he kept the Elendilmere and a few other things, a few other tokens from the remains of Isildur. But this is a copy of the Elendilmere, obviously, because there was other kings after, Isildur wasn't specifically a king of Gondor, although he was a high king. It's sort of a complicated mess to talk about. And come to think of it, one of the questions that I'm going to go into later is specifically about Denethor, and I guess this does come into it a little bit about the crowning of Aragorn and everything. So and specifically Gandalf's part in that is really important. So I guess this does have to do with that. But this was all set in motion in the First Age when Tur came to the sea and met Ulmo, the first mortal man to meet one of the Valar, other than a few very unfortunate people who had met Morgoth. Like Hurin, for example, and that didn't go too well. And of course, Hurin and Tur, they were cousins, so there's that as well. And anyway, guys, we have a lot to get to. I mean, it's only 10 questions, but some of them are pretty heady to talk about, so we're going to start here with your first question. Our first question here is coming in by the request of the Oski Voski, who asks, would Melkor not turn evil if he never was the most powerful among the Ainur? Really just an excellent question. I really like this. We're not explicitly told by the Silmarillion that Melkor's fall was due to him being the mightiest of the Ainur, but I would say that it's strongly implied. During the Ainulindala, his is the only name that is singled out, and we learn a bit about his personality in the following passage. I'm going to read you a bit of the Silmarillion. But now Ilúvatar sat and hearkened, and for a great while it seemed good to him, for in the music there were no flaws. But as the theme progressed, it came into the heart of Melkor to interweave matters of his own imagining that were not in accord with the theme of Ilúvatar. for he sought therein to increase the power and glory of the part assigned to himself. To Melkor, among the Ainur, had been given the greatest gifts of power and knowledge, and he had a share in all the gifts of his brethren. He had gone often alone into the void places, seeking the imperishable flame. For desire grew hot within him to bring into being things of his own, and it seemed to him that Iluvatar took no thought for the void. And he was impatient of its emptiness, yet he found not the fire, for it is with Iluvatar. But being alone, he had begun to conceive thoughts of his own, unlike those of his brethren. So here we're told that Melkor is not merely just the greatest of the Ainur in terms of might, but also knowledge. And this is significant, as well as the line, and he had a share in the gifts of his brethren. This is meaning that each of the Ainur was a bit specialized. They had certain things they were good at, but Melkor had all of their skills combined into him. Now let's compare this to a later passage about a very different character. I'm going to read you another passage from the Silmarillion here. It is told that after the flight of Melkor, the Valar sat long unmoved upon their thrones in the Ring of Doom. But they were not idle, as Feanor declared in the folly of his heart. For the Valar may work many things with thought rather than with hands, and without voices and silence they may hold counsel with one another. Thus they held vigil in the night of Valinor, and their thought passed back beyond Ea, and forth to the end. Yet neither power nor wisdom assuaged their grief, and the knowing of evil in the hour of its being. And they mourned not more for the death of the trees than for the marring of Feanor, of the works of Melkor, one of the most evil. For Feanor was made the mightiest in all parts of body and mind, in valor and endurance and beauty, in understanding and skill and strength and in subtlety alike. Of all the children of Iluvatar, and a bright flame was within him. The works of wonder for the glory of Arda that he might otherwise have wrought, only Manwe might in some measure conceive. And it was told by the Vanyar who held vigil with the Valar, that when the messengers declared to Manwe the answers of Feanor to his heralds, Manwe wept and bowed his head. But at that last word of Feanor, that at least the Noldor should do deeds to live in song forever, he raised his head, as one that hears a voice far off, and he said, So shall it be. Dear bought those songs shall be accounted, and yet shall be well bought, for the price could be no other. Thus even as Eru spoke to us, shall beauty not before conceived be brought into Ea, and evil yet be good to have been. But Mandos said, And yet remain evil. To me shall Feanor come soon. So Feanor is a bit like Melkor in some pretty key ways. Of course, we must not say this directly to him, lest he fly into a rage, for no one hated Melkor more than Feanor. But as I've been obligated to point out many times, evil is never cooperative, and Feanor being against Melkor doesn't make him, the good guy. As Melkor was made to be the greatest of the Ainur, Feanor was made to be the greatest of the children of Iluvatar, which would include not just all of the elves, but the mortal men as well. And we're told, more than just power and knowledge here, in all parts, body and mind, and further broken down into individual virtues of valor, endurance, beauty, understanding, skill, strength, and subtlety. Is it because Feanor was made to be the greatest that he fell? Is it because Melkor was made to be the greatest that he fell? We see hints of this debate between Manwe and Mandos. Manwe remembers the words of Iluvatar, and in fact he's communing with him, because it says that the Valar are speaking not with words, but their voices are echoing not only between them, but going out to the end. And that's with a capital E. They're going outside the world. They're communing with God himself in this instance. And getting wisdom from him. And even that's not enough to make them feel better about what has happened. It doesn't assuage their grief. But Manwe remembers what Iluvatar told him, that the existence of evil is good because it is Eru's will that those who try to do evil will, in their folly, still do greater good that they cannot even understand. We see examples of this also in discussions with Ulmo, in which it was said that Melkor brought bitter cold to the world, but Iluvatar pointed out that the bitter cold also brought the beauty of snow, and in clouds the mingling of the domains of Manwë and Ulmo that bring them closer together as brethren. This does not mean that Melkor intended those results. Something pointed out with great subtlety by Nama Mandos, who states that evil is still evil and has consequences in the world. There is an important thread that we see in the Legendarium, that you're diminished by evil. Melkor was the greatest and mightiest of the Ainur, but he felt that this entitled him to direct creation. He could not share the world with the Valar, declaring himself the Lord of the world, and he fought against his brethren. In this, he is diminished. He's defeated by Tulkas, who's one of the lesser Valar, with assistance from Oroma, who did not even need to lay hands on Melkor. Feanor is said to be the greatest of all the children, not just in might and beauty and skill, but in important virtues like understanding and subtlety. Where then is the understanding and subtlety in slaying his kin? In taking his oath and allowing his own dark thoughts to direct him, he becomes a mass murderer, inspiring a clan of mass murderers. He makes his way to Middle-earth on this grand crusade, and how long does he last exactly? He makes a beeline for Melkor, who doesn't even answer his challenge. He's killed by the Balrogs. And even as he died, he made his sons reiterate their own oath, not that they could have taken it back or renounced it at this point in time. And he died coming to Mandos, just as the Vala Nama Mandos said he would. From there, he must spend the rest of time waiting for the end of the world and his possible redemption. Melkor, already diminished, is diminished further. The evil act of destroying the two trees incarnates him, and he cannot cast off his Dark Lord guise, and he's bound to it. The wounds that he receives later from Fingolfin and Thorondor trouble him, and he loses to Ianwe in battle, and he's chained again, and he winds up ejected from the world. Even in the possible scenario of his return, he is destined to lose again, this time being slain by a mortal man. He went from being able to stand against the other 14 Valar united, to losing a physical contest to one of the lesser Valar, to losing to a Maya, and then finally to a mortal man. So is it the power itself that caused this fall? The idiom is that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and even the good can be corrupted by power, such as Bilbo or Boromir, though they may be redeemed. I would say no, though. I don't think it was Tolkien's intention to show us that having power means a fall. For we see many examples that do not fall. Feanor falls, but Fingolfin does not. Melkor falls, but Manwë does not. Saruman falls, but Gandalf does not, and he's rewarded with even greater power. Denethor falls, albeit to madness, not evil, but Aragorn does not. It is not the power itself, but the intention of what you wish to do with it. In the Third Age, the greatest of the children of Iluvatar, in all the same metrics that Feanor was the greatest, would be his niece, Galadriel. And the Valar were certainly worried about her and her intentions, and she rejects the additional power of the One Ring, even as she's tempted to take it and use it for good. She knows that evil is evil, as Namo Mandos so wisely and concisely said. Saruman's plan was to join Sauron and then guide his thoughts away from evil and towards good. Gandalf knew this was foolish, and to do such a thing would require becoming evil. Evil may, in the grand scheme, lead to the greater good, but on the local scale, it's still evil. We can throw up our hands and say it's God's will, but that doesn't mean rolling over and letting evil prevail. It is through the triumph of good over evil that evil's existence is good, not in the actions of evil ones. Melkor had great power, but he had the idea that he was entitled to whatever he wanted. He had what he had no entitlement for. If he was a better being, he might have used his power to guide and work in concert with all of the other Ainur, for he had a share in all their gifts. He could have been a fantastic force for good, but he chose to rebel instead because of his pride. The history of Arda is essentially one long lesson for Melkor. He had to see the way that it played out, and that his rebellion was ultimately pointless. It wasn't going to end the way that he wished it, at least. Feanor was partly his doing, as the Valar thought, but Feanor also could have rejected evil, but of course he, like Melkor, he had main character syndrome. And that's really the problem. It's not just having all that power and being the greatest, but having that main character syndrome where you start to think you're the only one who should or could do something. And that's usually the path to evil. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from the request of Kamali Kokavali, who asks, are Istari formidable fighters? Can their power save them from, for example, a group of soldiers? Of course, but I think this misses the point by a bit. I've said many times that it's not really proper to apply transitive properties to fictional characters in a fantasy setting. But here's one for you. Regardless, Durin's Bane, the Balrog, ended a civilization. The largest and greatest civilization of dwarves in Middle-earth's history, and he was equaled in might to Gandalf the Grey. Does this mean that Gandalf could have done what Durin's Bane did and destroyed all the dwarves and their city? It's a silly thought, because that's not at all how it works. A lesser but still great civilization of dwarves, Erebor, was ended by Smaug, as well as the city of Dale as well. But he was destroyed by a single man with a bow and arrow. Does this mean that Bard the bowman could solo Dale and Erebor? Of course not. But what we are told about Gandalf and the Balrog is important. They are equals. Gandalf himself states, after having a bit of a magical spat with a being that he could not see at this point, I have met my match and I have nearly been destroyed. In The Hobbit, Gandalf kills several goblins, that's the exact word used, several, with a single blast of what was described as lightning. Now, Bilbo estimates there were like 67 goblins that were present in this scene, 5 for each dwarf and 2 for him. But neither he nor the goblins that report the deed to the Great Goblin gives us a number of what several means, how many of them died when Gandalf did his lightning blast. But the result's the same. At least a good handful of goblins killed in a flash, and only because Bilbo had seen the goblins and shouted out that, and Gandalf reacted very quickly. If he had been prepared, it may have gone very differently. It may have been all of them. At 2 points later in the story, Gandalf prepares to destroy himself to take out large amounts of goblins and wargs. And both times he is saved the necessity of doing so by the arrival of the birds of heaven. Gandalf is the most hands-on wizard, and he fights in almost all of the major battles, being absent from fighting in Pelennor fields just because Pippin essentially dragged him away to save Faramir. And by the time that he was able to return, the battle ended anyway. So in Unfinished Tales, Círdan described Gandalf, who does not yet have that name, but is called the Grey Messenger, as the least of the wizards, the only one who, upon their arrival in Middle-earth, appears very old and is not as imposing as the others. One can only imagine the potential of the likes of Saruman the White, were he not such a coward. Radagast and the Blue Wizards had their own parts to play, but were rather subtle and hands-off in these actual conflicts, but this doesn't mean they're incapable of defending themselves. The wizards are angels bound to bodies. Their power is incredible, even in this fettered state. They are not, however, in Middle-earth to wipe out armies and to explode Sauron. They're here to lead and to inspire others to fight against evil, to unite us. That's the purpose of the wizards. So that's why you don't see them just going around blowing everybody up. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Our next question, I don't see a name here. Let me see if I can bring that up here. This might be an anonymous one. Let me just real quick see if I could find the name on this one. This was anonymous. Okay, so this is an anonymous question that came in. What would have happened if Saruman didn't betray the Whtie Council and led the Fellowship instead of Gandalf? So I've said many times that, these sort of questions are not really my favorite sort of thing. What would happen if this? What would happen if this was different? What would happen if that was different? What would happen if this character was completely out of character? What would happen if that character did something completely crazy? And I'm just going to try to illustrate a point here. Sauron wins. That's how that's what happens. It's very important to understand that the resolution of the Lord of the Rings was born out of a string of miracles. This is not, even getting into the whole divine intervention implied in the destruction of Gollum and the One Ring. Even the ring getting there was the result of several miracles just in a row. The odds were just so astronomically long. Gandalf was wise, but he was also operating on faith a lot of the time, and even at times he admitted that his words and his actions may seem foolish, but he operates on this gut feeling that generally pans out. Now, not for the first time, but not the last time, I'm going to make a reference to two different things. I'm going to start with Star Trek, though. Star Trek: The Next Generation, one of my favorite TV shows growing up, and there was this episode called Tapestry. It's probably one of the best episodes, definitely top 5, I think, episodes of Star Trek: The Next Generation. And in this, Captain Picard is given the chance to muck about with his past and to just do things differently. And he makes one little change, and the entire direction of his life going forward is changed in very fundamental ways. And he's not doing this on a whim, because he's died, essentially, and he's before somebody claiming to be Iluvatar. It's just Q, really. Somebody's like, I'm God, and I think Picard's line there was, you can't be God, the universe is not that poorly made, which I thought was a very great line. But anyway, the point is, he brings him back in time. That really, the reason that he died is because he had like a mechanical heart, and he had a mechanical heart because he got into a bar fight and was stabbed in the heart. So he just decides to go back in time because he has this opportunity and just not get into that fight at all. He makes this one little change to save his own life many years down the road, and he finds that the entire direction of his life going forward has changed in very fundamental ways. His personality is not even the same. People don't respect him. He's sort of in this dead-end job on the Enterprise, and people are like, oh, this guy, He states that life is like a tapestry, and that if you tug at loose threads, you might find yourself undoing the whole thing. Now, I'm going to give you another pop culture science fiction comparison to make. This is a more modern one. The Avengers, the films, the Avengers Endgame. In the preceding film, Doctor Strange does this thing where he uses the Time Stone to look in over 14 million different possible scenarios that can happen, and only a single one led to victory. And then in Avengers Endgame, he even says it to Tony Stark that if I tell you what will happen, it won't happen. He knows how the story could end in victory, and even the tiniest alteration to it would mean, well, Thanos wins. And this means that the only possible victory scenario, he has to be erased from existence, he has to return, and then specifically say that if he tells them how it's supposed to happen, it won't happen. The Lord of the Rings is like that. The smallest change means Sauron wins. So, to answer the question directly, a good Saruman changes things up drastically. It means that there's no delay in Theoden's arrival, meaning that the wizards working together naturally would be able to save Denethor. Gandalf would have babysat Denethor while Saruman went out to fight, or maybe the other way around. Denethor doesn't die, and this makes it highly unlikely that Aragorn becomes the king. And I'm going to talk about why later, because we have a question about Denethor and why he doesn't want Aragorn to be the king. They, of course, would not travel through Moria. It would be perfectly safe to use the Gap of Rohan. There's no danger from Saruman because he's leading the group, right? Boromir doesn't die. Maybe instead of the previous scenario, Saruman even personally guides Frodo and Sam to Samath Naur. Then what happens? Think of the power of the One Ring that no one could resist the urge to use, and Saruman being present. It doesn't end well. I could go on, but I think you just have to accept that the story had to happen exactly as it did. Let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Philip Burnett, who asks, are Balrogs really that powerful? Why do a lot of heroes like Ecthelion, Gandalf, and Glorfindel die fighting them? I know the last two got brought back to life. The quick and dirty answer is yes. They really are that powerful. To give an idea of how Balrogs fit into the world that Tolkien created, you must understand what they actually are. Now, as always, I start with the name. Balrog is a Sindarin term meaning powerful demon. The Bal part is derived from the Quenya Vala, which means power, and Rog means demon. and that's derived from the Quenya Rauco. So an elf in the Undying Lands who speaks Quenya might call one of these Valarauco, or several of them Valaraucor. The fact that the first part of the name given to them by the elves means power tells you a lot and hints at their true nature. In Tolkien's Legendarian, the big cheese is God himself, called Eru and Iluvatar, which is the One and the All-Father. The first beings he created were called the Ainur, which means holy ones, and they are, according to Tolkien, angelic in nature. Like in many cosmologies that include angels, there are good angels and there are bad angels. The baddest of them was Melkor, also called Morgoth, who also happened to be the mightiest of all the angels, as I mentioned earlier. Several other Ainur followed Melkor in his rebellion against God, with the most notable being Mairon, who was later called Sauron, but there were others, including the Balrogs. So when Gandalf, who himself is one of the Ainur, battles the Balrog, it is a battle between equals, two angels, which is why it was so difficult and so costly a battle. Ecthelion managed to destroy Gothmog, who was the greatest of the Balrogs, through mutual destruction by drowning it in water, and drawing it into the water and drowning the Balrog and himself as well. Well, Glorfindel managed to get in close and stab a Balrog through the midsection with his dagger, though it dragged him down as it fell by his hair. Keep in mind that, with Gandalf, dropping the Balrog into the pit didn't kill it. Nor did the Balrog dragging Gandalf down with his whip kill Gandalf. They both battled each other for 11 days straight after this, and Gandalf essentially won, and then died from exhaustion and his wounds that he had sustained. Now, it is at this point that you say, but John, I know I read, at least heard of stories where elves and men brought down Balrogs with greater ease. Didn't that tour guy kill like 5 of them? Do not worry, you are not tripping. Everything that I said is very much true as presented in stories like The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion. However, the Silmarillion was something that Tolkien started writing around 1917 and kept writing pretty much up until he died in 1973. He slowed down at the end, but you can see some of his very final thoughts in books like Morgoth's Ring or The Nature of Middle-earth, the latter of which fits in very well with the published version of the Silmarillion, and the former of which has ideas that would have reworked the entire mythos, and not for the first time. During the period of writing and rewriting and scrapping and reworking and rebooting his mythology, a lot of different ideas were present, and some of these earlier ideas got published, most notably in the Book of Lost Tales 1 and 2. These stories present ideas from before Tolkien had decided that the Balrogs were powerful fallen angels and that there were never any more than 7 of them. In this, they were powerful creatures used by the armies of Melko, who was later renamed Melkor, and they were difficult foes, but they could be destroyed by elves and men, such as trolls are difficult foes, and just at a higher level than trolls. Tur slaying 5 Balrogs in the primitive version of the Fall of Gondolin is meant to show how mighty he is, but of course once Tolkien reworked the Balrogs to be much more powerful and much less numerous, he removed these references. In-universe, these stories are probably just tales told in Numenor and Middle-earth, versions of true events told with dramatic flair and exaggeration. In Morgoth's Ring, we see his ideas even extended towards that the Silmarillion is itself not really the true events, truer than Book of Lost Tales, but still exaggerated in some way by the elves, while the Book of Lost Tales was exaggerated by the men. This plays into the idea that the survivors write the stories and that they're passed down, and sometimes when they're retold, they're changed a bit for drama. Bilbo even does this with his own story. The Hobbit, I find it unlikely that one of the trolls he ran into had a very English-sounding name like Bill Huggins. Gandalf himself notes that a lot of what Bilbo wrote down was true only in a very broad stroke sense. The Elvish account of Balrogs is the more correct one, as they're immortal and they don't need to pass the story down from many, many generations. So their stories get changed less. Though the Silmarillion is told through the lens of having been translated by one Mr. Bilbo Baggins. But yeah, there was a time where Tolkien wrote about Balrogs, and there was like a whole lot of them, hundreds of them, armies of them, and they could be killed. But the ones that are presented in The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion are very, very powerful. They're fallen angels. There's anywhere between 3 and 7 of them. 7 is really the most accepted number. So yes, they're really on that level. Okay, next question. Our next question comes in from Gregory Rivera, who asks, why did Gimli or Gandalf not know the secret password to get into Moria? Why was the password inscribed in Elvish? So for Gimli's part, he had never been to Moria before. Gandalf made the mistake of thinking that there was a secret password. There was no secret password to get into Moria, only a word that had to be said. Now you might say, well, that's the same thing, but it wasn't a secret. It was written on the door in plain view. Gandalf and Legolas and probably Aragorn could read it plainly. Frodo is familiar with the Sindarin language to a certain extent, as taught to him by Bilbo, but he's unfamiliar with the specific writing mode seen on the door, and he asks, what does it say? And Gandalf makes the mistake of thinking that the words are not important. And he reads them out, but he doesn't read them in Elvish. He reads it in, the Westron English. He translates it for Frodo. If Gandalf had spoken the words on the door in Sindarin, the door would have popped right open. As, after all, this is what it said. Emen Durinaran Moria, pedo melon amino. Im narvi heinen chan. Celebrimbro oregian telsar titwaihin. The word melon opens the door. Gandalf transliterates rather than translates. The pedo melon amino becomes speak, friend, and enter. Gandalf is failing to remember that the Sindarin word for speak and say are the same. They don't have differing words, so the more accurate translation, say, friend, and enter. Merry sort of gave him the thought that leads to him solving the riddle. Gandalf chortles at his overthinking the situation. He stated that he forgot that the doors were made in friendlier times. They would have once stood open with friendly dwarves welcoming in their elvish friends. But which brings us to the last part of the question. Why was it in Elvish? Why was it inscribed in Sindarin? The Doors of Durin were made by the dwarf Narvi and enchanted by the elf Celebrimbor. These dwarves made this door that faced Eregion, which is also called Hallen, and for all intents and purposes, this was essentially the Elvish entrance to Moria. Celebrimbor founded Eregion as this sort of vassal state of Lindon, but he put it where it was specifically because he wanted to be near Moria. He was a great friend to the dwarves, and he wished to be in fellowship with them and to learn from them. So this door was made specifically for elves to use, and thus the letters being in their language, it makes a whole lot of sense, especially as the dwarves tend to keep their own language a secret. Okay, next question. This next one's a rather quick one. This came in from Brian Perkins, who asks, how did Shelob penetrate Frodo's mithril vest? She didn't. The film really, I think, muddied the waters in this sense. As seen in the image that I'm showing here, Shelob's sting is about level with his chest. And then in the actual film where it's all, in motion, she swoops down to sting him, and she seems to even go even lower than that, although we don't actually see the point of entry. It seems reasonable to decide that as far as the film is concerned, she might have gotten him in, the leg. We get a shot of Shelob's sting swooping very low, and then sort of coming up for a sort of upward stabbing motion, and then it cuts to this close-up of Frodo as he's stung in his face. In the book, though, there's no ambiguity whatsoever about where Frodo was stung. I'm going to read you a very brief section here. "Master, dear master," he said, but Frodo did not speak. As he had run forward, eager, rejoicing to be free, Shelob, with hideous speed, had come behind him, and with one swift stroke had stung him in the neck. He now lay pale, and heard no voice, and did not move. The mithril armor that Frodo wears is it's never really described as a vest, like you said, but it's sometimes referred to as a shirt, sometimes as a coat. But either way, its protection did not extend to his neck. The mithril shirt or coat saved Frodo several times. There was an orc with a spear that would have killed him, except he was just merely sort of bruised from it. Shortly after that, there was an arrow that sort of just bounced off of him. And then later on, Saruman tried to stab him with a knife. But in this case, his enemy went for the neck, which was unprotected. It's likely that either Gollum told Shelob that previously that Frodo was wearing some sort of armor, or possibly that Shelob just preferred to sting in the neck, or maybe just wherever she sees flesh. So she didn't get through the armor, is what I'm getting at here. All right, next question. Our next question, this is a rather big one. This came in from Mark Blomers. I hope I'm saying it right there. Is it possible that Denethor felt more threatened by Gandalf than by the coming of Aragorn? To him, they were one and the same. One of the questions that crops up a lot for me, people ask a lot on Quora and elsewhere, is why does Denethor favor his son Boromir over his other son Faramir? The answer to that is very complex and something that I've covered extensively, but there are two passages in The Return of the King that give us an important insight. Here's the first one. "Yes, I wish that indeed," said Denethor, "for Boromir was loyal to me and no wizard's pupil. He would have remembered his father's need, and would not have squandered what fortune gave. He would have brought me a mighty gift." In this, Denethor is speaking to Faramir, who has asked him if he wishes that he had gone in Boromir's place. Some people, including Peter Jackson, have interpreted this to mean that Denethor wishes that Faramir had died in place of Boromir, but I don't think that's true. I believe that Denethor is of the mind that had Faramir and Boromir switched places, they both would have lived. Faramir would not have been tempted by the One Ring. He wouldn't, so he would not have attempted to take it from Frodo, and thus the party would not have been so separated. When orcs arrive, Boromir would have been an Ithilien, but he would have seized the ring and brought it to Denethor for safekeeping. Gandalf disabuses him of this notion. Boromir would have taken the ring not to bring to Denethor, but to keep for himself. And Gandalf himself states that he would have happily have brought it to Denethor for safekeeping if he trusted him, but he doesn't trust him with the ring. He doesn't even trust himself with the ring. The important thing here, though, is that Faramir is a student of Gandalf. Denethor puts it, he's a wizard's pupil, and thus, of course, Faramir agrees with Gandalf, not Denethor in this. Denethor doesn't see it this way. He thinks the ring absolutely should be kept safe in Minas Tirith, though he may understand the folly of this in his last hours, as he believes Sauron would be taking over the city. Which brings me to the second passage. "I would have things as they were in all the days of my life," answered Denethor, "and then in the days of my long fathers before me, to be the lord of this city in peace, and to leave my chair to a son after me, who would be his own master and no wizard's pupil. But if doom denies this to me, then I will have naught, neither life diminished, nor love halved, nor honor abused." In this passage, Denethor is speaking to Gandalf. In his plan to destroy Faramir and himself, he believes Faramir's died and that he will be shortly captured and tortured by Sauron's forces. His wishes are plain. He wants to remain the ruling steward and to pass the chair of steward on to his son, who will rule on his own, not under the tutelage or control of anyone else. And this is what gets us to the crux of the issue. Denethor does not like or trust Gandalf, and he has come to believe that Gandalf is attempting, for whatever reason, to take over Gondor through his puppet Aragorn. Gandalf tells him otherwise, that like Denethor, he himself is a steward, not of Gondor or even of Middle-earth, but of Arda, the world itself, and that it is not in his place to rule, but to care for the land and to fight for it with everything he has. He cannot shake Denethor's belief that Aragorn is a puppet, but and with Boromir gone and the enemy at his gates, he sees the end of his dynasty. He's prepared to deny Aragorn's claim to the throne, but he does not trust his son Faramir to do the same. So in his mind, the wizard is one. His only son is in the wizard's pocket. So whether Gondor is ruled by Faramir or by Aragorn, he feels that the real ruler is going to be Gandalf. Denethor's distrust of Gandalf runs deep and is tied to his early usage of the Anor Palantir. While Denethor was able to use the Palantir for many years before coming into Sauron's crosshairs, his early usage of it gave him knowledge that he would not have otherwise had. I'm going to give you a passage from Appendix A that gives us some additional insight. "Ecthelion II, son of Turgon, was a man of wisdom. With what power was left to him, he began to strengthen his realm against the assault of Mordor. He encouraged all men of worth, from near or far, to enter his service, and to those who proved trustworthy he gave rank and reward. In much that he did, He had the aid and advice of a great captain whom he loved above all. Thorongil, men called him in Gondor, the Eagle of the Star, for he was swift and keen-eyed, and wore a silver star upon his cloak. But no one knew his true name, nor in what land he was born. He came to Ecthelion from Rohan, where he had served the king Thengel, but was not one of the Rohirrim. He was a great leader of men, by land or by sea, but he departed into the shadows whence he came, before the days of Ecthelion were ended. Thorongil often counselled Ecthelion that the strength of the rebels of Umbar was a great peril to Gondor and a threat to the fiefs of the south that would prove deadly, if Sauron moved to open war. At last he got leave of the steward and gathered a small fleet, and he came to Umbar unlooked for by night, and there burned a great part of the ships of the corsairs. He himself overthrew the captain of the haven in battle upon the quays, and when he withdrew his fleet with small loss. But when they came back to Pelargir, to men's grief and wonder, he would not return to Minas Tirith, where great honour awaited him. He sent a message of farewell to Ecthelion, saying, "Other tasks now call me, lord, and much time and many perils must pass ere I come again to Gondor, if that be my fate." Though none could guess what those tasks might be, nor what summons he had received, it was known whither he went, for he took a boat and crossed over Anduin, and there he said farewell to his companions and went on alone, and when he was last seen his face was towards the Mountains of Shadow. There was dismay in the city at the departure of Thorongil, and to all men it seemed a great loss, unless it were to Denethor the son of Ecthelion, a man now ripe for the stewardship, who after 4 years he succeeded on the death of his father. Denethor II was a proud man, tall, valiant, and more kingly than any man that had appeared in Gondor for many lives of men. And he was wise also, and far-sighted, and learned in lore. Indeed, he was as like to Thorongil as to one of nearest kin, and yet was ever placed second to the stranger in the hearts of men and the esteem of his father. At the time many thought that Thorongil had departed before his rival became his master, though indeed Thorongil had never vied with Denethor, nor held himself higher than the servant or of his father. And in one matter only were their counsels to the steward at variance. Thorongil often warned Ecthelion not to put trust in Saruman the Wise in Isengard, but to welcome rather Gandalf the Grey. But there was little love between Denethor and Gandalf, and after the days of Ecthelion there was less welcome for the Grey Pilgrim in Minas Tirith. Therefore later, when all was made clear, many believed that Denethor, who was subtle in mind and looked further and deeper than other men of his day, had discovered who this stranger Thorongil in truth was, and suspected that he and Mithrandir designed to supplant him. Now we could see here the genesis of Faramir's daddy issues, being the second in his father's heart, as Denethor felt that he was the second in his own father's heart to Thorongil, a guy who came out of nowhere and gave his father counsel, seemingly supplanting him, and then he vanishes without a trace. We see hints here as to the nature of Denethor's thoughts in the very specific language used. Denethor is described specifically as far-sighted, which, if you were to translate that phrase, far-sighted, into Quenya Elvish, you would have Palantir, from the root Palan, which means far and wide, and Tir is to overlook. Later, in the same paragraph, it comes up again with Denethor being described as subtle in mind and looked further and deeper than other men of his day, and had somehow discovered that Thorongil was in cahoots with Mithrandir, which translates to Grey Pilgrim and is a pretty typical Sindarin name for Gandalf the Grey. This section of Appendix A does not outright say that Denethor is using the Palantir at this state, but we are given that information in Unfinished Tales. I'm going to give you a little bit of that. I actually read it last week in my reading, but I'm going to give you just a little bit here. Denethor had dared to use the stone was and remains a matter of conjecture. Gandalf might well think that he did on the manor, but it is probable, considering Denethor and what is said about him, that he began to use the Anar stone many years before 3019, and earlier than Saruman ventured or thought it useful to use the stone of Orthanc. Denethor succeeded to the stewardship in 2984, being then 54 years old, a masterful man, both wise and learned beyond the measure of those days, and strong-willed, confident in his own powers, and dauntless. His grimness was first observable to others when his wife Finduilis died in 2988. But it seems fairly plain that he had at once turned to the stone as soon as he came to power, having long studied the matter of the Palantir and the traditions regarding them, and their use preserved in the special archives of the stewards, available beside the ruling steward only to his heir. It is mentioned that Denethor becomes steward in the Third Age, 2984, at the age of 54. The Lord of the Rings mentioned this was 4 years after Thorongil left Gondor. It also mentions that he started using the Palantir pretty much immediately. An earlier passage in Unfinished Tales states that Denethor's usage of the Palantir gave him premature old age, visible when he was only 60, so 6 years after his ascension to the station of ruling steward. He was of a stock that lived long due to Númenórean heritage. For example, his son Faramir lived to be 120 years old. So Denethor, appearing to be an old man at 60, was somewhat unusual and is chalked up partly due to the loss of his young wife and mostly due to his use of the Palantir. So in looking far and wide using the stone through Middle-earth, he would see Thorongil often in the councils of Gandalf and disliking Thorongil for seemingly usurping him in his father's heart. And there's a bit of a parallel here between Denethor and Feanor, actually. He comes to dislike and distrust Gandalf. And of course it was mentioned that he already didn't like Gandalf, but now he really doesn't like him. Now imagine how he felt. Around 40 years later, Gandalf shows up in Gondor again, bearing news of the death of his beloved son Boromir, although he already knows his son Boromir died. But through the Seeing Stone, he sees him telling this halfling, don't mention Boromir. So he's feeling that Gandalf is being deceptive here, and he has Thorongil with him, now calling himself Aragorn. Now, Appendix A doesn't directly tell us that Thorongil and Aragorn are the same person, but Appendix B clears it up with no ambiguity whatsoever. To Denethor's perspective, Aragorn already usurped him in one way, and is now looking to usurp him in another. And Gandalf is the person behind these machinations, that Boromir was traveling with Gandalf, who seemingly died and was not present when his son was killed, and then turns up alive with Aragorn. It comes off as suspicious to a man who's grown increasingly suspicious and paranoid, especially as now Sauron has contacted him and filled his head with all sorts of horrors. What's worse, even if he successfully repels Sauron's assault and denies Aragorn the throne, his remaining son is a wizard's pupil, so either way he finds himself in check and mate. His legacy is to fall to the wizard, who will one way or another, in his mind, have Gondor in his pocket. Of course he's incorrect. Gandalf crowns Aragorn, and then a few years later he leaves Middle-earth entirely. But perhaps after his death, maybe Denethor, in the afterlife, would have found peace and truth and saw that the land that he loved so was more, in better care with Aragorn, who did not shunt Faramir to the side, but kept him in his station as steward and even gave him his own princedom in Ithilien. So there you go. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Kamali Kogavali, who asks, in the Lord of the Rings movies, who is the main character, Frodo, Gandalf, or Aragorn? One could make an argument for any one of them, or you could just say Sam's the main character. This doesn't change whether you're discussing the films or the books, although I think the films diminish Frodo a lot. In the book, Frodo encompasses the entire story into a book himself, and here's the title. The Downfall of the Lord of the Rings and the Return of the King, as seen by the little people, being the memoirs of Bilbo and Frodo of the Shire, supplemented by the accounts of their friends and the learning of the wise. Frodo's attribution for the story written is not really himself, but the little people, and he's just sort of the one, him and Bilbo are the ones writing it all down. There's no doubting that Sam wrote a lot of it, and there were many parts that Merry and Pippin wrote, and of course, he states that Bilbo had a hand. There is also by the accounts of their friends and the learning of the wise, because there's parts of the story that would be told by Gimli or Legolas. There's parts of the story that would be told by Gandalf. But of course, the actual title is what's important. This makes the biggest case that, Aragorn is sort of the main character of the overall story. The title is a very clear good versus evil. The Lord of the Rings is Sauron, and the king is Aragorn. Of course, Aragorn didn't bring the ring to Mount Doom. He didn't do a lot of things to make that possible. And of course, Gandalf did a lot of things to make that possible, as Aragorn stated when he was crowned, that this is Gandalf's victory. And Frodo would realize all this later when they reunited and told each other, all the things that they had done. And this is just sort of Frodo's opinion. I could make an argument that Frodo's the main character, or I could make an argument that Gandalf's the main character or Sam is the main character. But here's the truth. There's no main character in the books or the films. The Lord of the Rings is an ensemble cast, and no one is always present. Of course, there's a Iluvatar. Iluvatar is always present, as mentioned in one of Tolkien's letters. He said, always present but never named. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Link of Wise, who asks, what would Sauron have done if Pharazôn demanded he hand over the One Ring while he was surrounded by the Númenóreans after his initial defeat prior to being taken to the island? Would he have given it in order to corrupt him or just fight? So the question here is making an assumption that leads to the question, but let's adjust the assumption, because it would never happen. The situation couldn't happen. Pharazôn absolutely would have demanded such a thing. It would have been prudent to deprive Sauron of such a thing as the One Ring. The question isn't what would happen if Pharazôn did this, but why didn't he? And the answer is simple. There's no indication that Pharazôn had any knowledge or even an inkling as to the existence of the One Ring. The One Ring was known to the elves of Eregion, and those that Celebrimbor told of it, Galadriel, Gil-galad, Elrond. We may also assume some among other great elves of Middle-earth would know about it, Celeborn, Glorfindel, but it wasn't something that mortal men really knew about. The elves of Middle-earth did not go to Númenor, so there's no reason to believe that they would have informed the king. The king did travel to Middle-earth. After all, he was the one that went to Mordor with his army and captured Sauron. But you need to remember one important fact. Pharazôn wanted almost nothing to do with the elves. Even his kingly title, Ar-Pharazôn, in Adunaic, it's a slight to the elves, as he was spurning the Númenórean tradition of using Quenya titles and honorifics. If he was a friend to the elves at all, he would have been called Tarkalion. So he was not in contact with elves, nor would he have listened to their wisdom if he was. The follow-up question that may come to your lips at this point is, why would he not plainly see the ring on Sauron's figure? Well, that's easy. It was invisible. Sauron had the ring with him. We know this despite the awkward bit in the Silmarillion that kind of makes it seem like he didn't, but without directly stating so, due to Tolkien clarifying it in his letters, however, we know that he had the ring with him in Númenor, and it was hidden from view. Now, we would know this is possible for him to do as its master. Even Tom Bombadil was able to hide the ring briefly from Frodo, to the point where Frodo even put on the ring, making himself invisible to his friends, but not to Bombadil, to prove to himself that Bombadil had not, pulled some sort of trick, some sort of sleight of hand and switch the rings. And, he had to prove to himself that this was his ring. And the scene is important for two reasons. One, to show that Bombadil is not affected by the ring. And the other reason, and I think the more important thing, is to show that Frodo's grown accustomed to it. It's grown precious to him. We knew this already from earlier. He couldn't throw it into the hearth, even after Gandalf demonstrated that his fire wouldn't even warm it up, much less harm it. But now he has to prove to himself that the ring returned to him by Bombadil is really his ring. So tangents aside, someone with sufficient mastery over the ring can hide it from view, so Pharazôn never saw it. He would have absolutely no reason to know of its existence otherwise. Of course, he would have demanded it. He absolutely would have done that. And then, as to what Sauron would have done, it kind of doesn't matter. Because, like I said, it would have been hidden. He could have said, "What ring? What are you talking about?" So it really doesn't matter, because that's just, like I said, the story has to be the way it is. I'm not interested in reading this or writing this sort of alternate take on it. All right, let's get to our final question. Our final question comes in from Margaret Johnson, who asks, is Melkor the only Ainu to feel fear? Of course not. Of course not. It may be easier to list the Ainur that didn't feel fear. Perhaps Tulkas? He was certainly brave and warlike, but that doesn't actually mean that he never felt fear. Bravery isn't an absence of fear. It's an overcoming of fear. There is no reason to believe that there is a single Vala or Maya that is completely fearless. The closest that I could come to is maybe Namamandos, but he's such a cipher. We don't get a whole lot of his personality. He seems wholly emotionless, other than when he was moved by Luthien. But of course, he had a wife that I'm sure he loved greatly. Maybe he was just very closed off in public and he didn't show his emotions often. I don't know. But Sauron fears what his enemies can do if they have the One Ring. He fears Aragorn. Gandalf fears what may happen to his friends. And in fact, back when he was known only as a Loren and he was told that he must go to Middle-earth, he said he didn't wish to because he was afraid. Manwë told him that this fear is why he must go. Saruman so feared Sauron that he could see no victory except through pretending to join Sauron and trying to guide him to good. I actually did a quick search in my digital copy of The Lord of the Rings, and the phrase, I fear, or something containing it, such as I feared, actually came up 89 times, and the first 5 are all Gandalf. So, yeah. And I had a pretty back and forth with Margaret after this, who asks me, with Gandalf and the Balrogs specifically, what is going through his mind with the Battle of the Balrog? Fear of dying? Was his courage to do with the threat of death? It sounds dismissive, which is stupid, and I agree. In the case of Gandalf fighting the Balrog, he's essentially sacrificing himself, and he doesn't know if Frodo will be successful without his guidance. He doesn't know that he will be able to return, or when he does, will he be able to help Frodo directly? And he isn't. He doesn't get to go join Frodo. The Valar, they don't fear what Melkor could do to them specifically, but what he can and does do to Ilúvatar's children. So you see, when the good guys have fear, it's more about what can evil do to people I care about, and when the bad guys feel fear is what's going to happen to me. And of course that doesn't mean that having fear for yourself is evil. It's just that when you see these characters that really have no reason to fear for their own safety, they still have reason to fear for other people's safety. Frodo, for example, fears for his own safety. It doesn't make him a selfish person, but he's also worried about the Shire and everybody in it. He has to get out of the Shire because the Nazgûl are on their way. So yeah, fear is not necessarily a bad thing. It's how you react to fear and what actions you take out of fear that could be good or bad. Anyway, I had a blast. I'm sure you guys could tell I had a really good time doing this video for you guys today. I will see you guys next week. If you have questions for me, send them my way through comments or through Quora or whatever, and subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the subscribe button. That really helps me out. If you're already subscribed, well, check that you are, because sometimes people get randomly unsubscribed. But if you're already subscribed, just leave me a comment or something. Say hi. It doesn't even matter if you have a question or something, because that's engagement, and that sort of feeds into the algorithm and makes sure that my videos get shown to more people. And I will see you guys next time.